Okay.
Yeah. Good
So
evening,
good
everyone.
evening.
Yeah. So good morning to the speaker and welcome to Radio Sofia. I'm Kranti. I'm coordinator of Radio Sofia and the PhD student at IIM Calcutta. And Radio Sofia is a platform to discuss socioeconomic and political issues. And one of the major aims is to bridge the knowledge gap between academia and the general public by discussing the ideas hidden in the books and academic journals in simple words. And in one such attempt today, we have with us Dr. Vasabjit Bannerjee, author of the book Undoing the Revolution, Comparing Elite Subversion of Peasant Rebellions. Dr. Banerjee is an assistant professor of political science and public administration at Mississippi State University. He has a PhD degree in political science from Indiana University and MA in political science from Miami University, Ohio. His primary research interests are contentious politics and the local political economies of state formation in developing societies, specifically South Asia, Latin America, and Southern Africa. And the timing of this talk, elite subversion of peasant rebellions, is no less than perfect given the ongoing farmer protests in the country against the three agricultural policy bills passed by the government of India. And the national media and the national highways are up and roaring the slogan Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan yet again. And so I think it becomes very important to understand how such large scale farmer movements or peasant rebellions are mobilized in opposition to the state in agrarian societies, and on what factors do their success depend on, and how do these rebellions transform state institutions post rebellions. And I think in this book, Dr. Banerjee also emphasizes on the inevitable alliances between peasants and local elites in popular mobilizations, and how the elite dominates the formation of post-revolutionary state. And he's comparing basically in the book Mexico, late colonial India, and Zimbabwe, white-dominated Zimbabwe during different periods spanning the 20th century. So without any further ado, I invite Dr. Banerjee to take the stage and tell what
So
he thinks.
Dr. Banerjee has been shifting around, so you don't see the ceiling fan in his room, but this is his office, home office. Anyway, so thank you so much for the invitation, and I would like to sort of talk to you about my book, essentially. The book really comes from a situation of being in India in the 1980s and 90s and growing up in India in the 1980s and 90s. Because one thing that was quite clear to me at that point of time was that we were living in an economically failed society, especially in the 1980s when I was a boy. And because there were so many things that were constantly missing. Products were missing, or shoddy. We had two models of cars. It was an economically miserable time. People didn't have jobs for years. One forgets that situation, and that always irked me in the sense that there were all these promises of revolution, of promises of massive change and modernization, big posters, and this yojana and that yojana, but nothing really came out of it. So that was that, and I never really put two and two together. And I started working on this project about a few years ago at Indiana University, about 2000, not a few years ago, I'd say more than a decade, about 2009, 2008, 2009. And it was also informed by a similar situation that had occurred in Mexico, where you had this major developmental push, and that crashed in the 1980s. But I was interested in understanding how these urges for these massive developmental pushes arise and why they fail so miserably. And I looked at India and Mexico, and I realized both of them have had these major peasant rebellions, right? And much has been written about these peasant rebellions, especially from the left. And left-wing writers have often written that these rebellions have been caused by peasants and for grievances against inequality, lack of political domination, so on and so forth. And this stream of thought continues to dominate the field, shape the field of peasant studies. But I asked myself the question that if the peasants succeeded in societies, such as India and Mexico, right? The Gandhian coalition was essentially a peasant coalition. That was Gandhi's claim to fame. That was his greatest contribution, is he brings the masses, and at that point of time, the masses meant the peasants, into Indian politics. It's not sainted. It's not really non-violence. outside of books written for the people. Non-violence was a tactical measure for Gandhi. But the real measure the real change that he brings is the peasant masses are entered into Indian politics. Now, but it fails. That's the question. Why would millions of people walk onto the stage in Indian politics only to sort of be pushed aside, disappear? And it's the same case in Mexico under the revolution. Now in India, they didn't have guns. In Mexico, these peasants had guns. They had guns, they had horses, and famous names like Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, world-renowned figures. And they fought on horseback and they defeated the hacienda owners, and yet they also disappear. So how did this happen? And that was my dissertation, really. And then I moved to South Africa because I was advised that a similar situation had happened in Zimbabwe, where there had been a proper peasant rebellion, and the peasant rebellion had also collapsed. And you had Robert Mugabe, and we know what happened to Zimbabwe in the 1990s and the 2000s, similar situation. I was not allowed into Zimbabwe at that point of time. I mean, if you're doing research on land reform and authoritarianism, Robert Mugabe isn't exactly going to allow you into Harare to study stuff. So I got a postdoctorate at the University of Pretoria for a year. And the University of Pretoria at that time was blessed with having some of the best people in Zimbabwe present, including, I think, the best Zimbabwean historian, Alois Molambo, was at that time at the University of Pretoria. I did not work with him. I worked with somebody else who was a labor historian and a historian of India as well, sociologist, historical sociology, Jonathan Heslop. He's now in the United States. Anyway, so he invited me over because he thought the research was promising. And I said, okay, let's go and study the stuff. So I did. I went to South Africa and I visited Zimbabwe. And yes, the answer that I arrived at, which I had been it had been present in my dissertation, but not so clearly, is that peasant rebellions occur in a two-step process. And most of the research focuses on the first step partially, so not even the entire first step. And I partly blame it because of theoretical lenses. And at the cost of being unpopular, there's which I am already, there's a sort of a superimposed Marxist lens on peasant rebellions in a lot of cases. And this lens, what it does is it takes away the agency of peasants. It takes away the agency, ironically, of those who ally with the peasants. And it has to stop before the regime forms, because really the regimes are disasters. So I said, at least for peasants. So I said, so let me get on with the story. The story is that peasants essentially are poor. That's the cause of the rebellion, is that they are poor, they are politically dominated, they are marginalized in essence. And they live in the villages, they don't live in the cities. They're scattered. And peasants cannot risk rising up, because who will till their fields? Who will tend to the cattle? So the cost of rising up is extremely high. And with entrenched elites, the cost of repression is also, the risk of repression is also extremely high. Because the elites have the guns. They have the local National Guard or the army, or the British flying columns back in the old days. They would, so it was the police. So rising up is quite costly for the peasants, and the risks of retaliation, repression is quite high. So how do you overcome the costs and the risks? And I'm talking to IIM people, so this way of looking at rebellions. And so the risks are reduced if elites participate in these rebellions, if elites join the peasants. They provide resources. Now, resources can be money, funds, they can be guns, weapons. In Mexico, that was a big deal. They could be diplomatic support. You wouldn't believe this, but foreign, corralling foreign opinion to your side. They could be, aside from diplomatic support, that could be information, simply who else has things going on that you can connect into, as well as brokerage. By the way, I think Gandhi was one of the best brokers, political brokers in the world. he created a massive national movement by tying in hundreds of smaller movements across India. These movements would have been restricted to Bengal or Assam or Tamil Nadu or Maharashtra. But what he does is he taps into these movements and he attaches a national characteristic to them and allows their leaders to participate in the Congress party. So he was a fantastic broker of movements as well. And so he brings, so in India, you have a set of elites who come in to help the peasants. And these are the famous, this is part of the nationalist historiography, the bourgeoisie, domestic bourgeoisie, the hot bourgeoisie. So people like Birla, they come in to help the national movement. He's one of the biggest ones that I talk about. And they come in after they realize that the British, who they were very close to until the early 1920s, essentially are more intent on supporting British industry rather than encouraging Indian industry. But you also have the professional class. And I think most Indians know about the participation of this set of people. Nehru is the leader, their leader, and they come in. And I have quoted in my book a passage from Nehru where Nehru decries peasant rebellions by Baba Ramdev, not Ramdev, forgetting his name, but he's also sort of a Hindu religious leader. And Nehru says, these peasants have no idea what they're doing. But he later joins in under the tutelage of Gandhi. And so why is that? And that is because they have the numbers, the peasants have the numbers, the elites have the resources. And that is what allows them to overcome the barriers to rebellions. I mean, so ironically, a massive peasant rebellion at the end in India yields a Cambridge-educated, Harrow-educated, Harrow-Eton, I forget. Anyway, Harrow, British public school-educated, Cambridge-educated lawyer as the first Prime Minister of India, who then embarks on a massive urban industrialization policy at the behest of the Bombay Plan, which is domestic business houses that want government support, and pushes aside any idea of major agricultural change. He tries to impose collectivization of agriculture in the 1950s, but that is debarred because it would have been a horrendous idea to collectivize agriculture. But he tried to do it, and even that fails. So he tries to go far left and tries to do something. But anyway, it doesn't matter. The peasants are off the board. They're not part of the scene. Same thing happens in Mexico with different characters. You have the rise of the constitutionalists in Mexico, who use Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa and other groups of rebels to rise to power. But once they are in power, they quickly remove these people by violently. Both Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa are defeated in battle by people that they push to power. And then they're both assassinated by people that they had pushed to power. This is an important thing that most people don't remember, is that, and this is the irony, is that the Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, for example, were leaders who pushed the constitutionalists to power against the pre-revolutionary regime, which had initially been pushed out by reformist President Madero, who was then removed in a counter-coup by a pre-revolutionary General Huerta. And so Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata fought against Huerta and defeated Huerta. They were some of the most successful generals and political leaders, but they too couldn't last. And in Mexico, similar to India, you had a regime of northern industry, finance, as well as the new professional class, small professional class, small business owners from small and medium enterprise owners from northern Mexico take over. And again, the peasants are pushed out. In Zimbabwe, similarly, you have a massive rebellion in the 1970s against white minority rule. Here, capital is not entirely domestic. In Mexico, it is the people who come to power, domestic capital plays a part. In Zimbabwe, it's mostly foreign investments in minerals, in the mineral sector, as well as farmers, white farmers. This set of people force a solution on Mugabe, essentially. They create a system wherein major economic changes cannot be made. Pro-peasant economic changes cannot be made. And the ZANU-PF, which even today rules Zimbabwe, is forced to do away with any ambitions of land reforms. Land reforms occur in Mexico, land reforms occur in India. Land reforms do not occur in Zimbabwe. And for 20 years, people extolled the virtues of land reforms not occurring in Zimbabwe. Right? I mean, I grew up with the articles that Zimbabwe is doing so great because they didn't reform the land. Well, what you did was you created a massive pressure cooker. In Mexico and India, land reforms do occur. But in India, for example, and since I'm talking to an Indian audience, the land reforms are not complete. What they do is they take land from the big zamindars and the talukdars in the permanent settlement areas, and they give it to the middlemen, the people who supported the Congress. In Bengal, they were known as the jotedars. In other places, they had different names. In Punjab, in United Punjab, they had an entirely different set of land tenure system, and I can talk about that later if you have a question. But Punjab was very loyal to the British, and right up until the end, the Punjab remained quite loyal to the British, and the Punjab Unionist Party survived until the 40s. Now, when I say Punjab Unionist, you should look this up. The name Unionist means they took their name from the Ulster Unionists of Northern Ireland, which meant that they were as loyal as the Northern Irish Protestants to the British Crown. And they had to be, because they were mostly the major players, political players, and their supporters were land grantees, people who had received land grants from the British Crown in the canal colonies that were built for them. And entire cities were built, urban planned cities were built, towns were built with farmland and so on and so forth. And the way you got these grants were associated with the British Army. The Sikhs fell out later with the British by the 1920s, but Punjabi Muslims were pro-British right up until the end, until the 1940s. And in fact, Pakistan becomes a republic in 1956. It remains a dominion from 1947 to 1956. The ties between those communities are quite close. Nonetheless, in the broader palimpsest, in India, the peasants are pushed out right after the success of the peasant rebellions of the 1920s. And it's pretty apparent by the 1930s that the peasants are no longer making a decision about politics. The leaders are Nehru and Patel and Gandhi and so on and so forth. And partially you can notice this with the exile almost of people like Vinoba Bhave, and sort of the exile and sort of the peripheral nature of things like the Bhudan movement. But also you can notice it with the massive urban industrialization that takes place in India, and the crippling of the agricultural sector by a variety of things, including partial land reforms. One of these things is the mandi system. So now that's being challenged in Punjab, but to be honest with you, it has been bypassed in places like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, because this used to exist all over India, but it doesn't exist there, partly because of caste mobility in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. The entry and exit into the class of people, not the class in the sense of economic class, but the set of people, the segment of people who controlled these mandis, has become way more fluid. So they exist, but the way that they captured village life and captured the local economy has gone. And that explains the rise in some ways of the regional parties, of the OBC parties, of the Dalit parties in northern India, in parts of eastern India. So that set was critical for Congress' success in controlling the peasant vote in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. They were the village, what we can call the village notables, the village upper classes that corralled the peasants during the Gandhian Revolution. But as we now know, the result of that is stasis and stagnation. Sorry for the sort of rambling ways and the digressions, but I just wanted to summarize the paper, the book in this fashion. Thank you.
Those diversions were really informative and interesting. So, uh, yeah, I think it's been wonderful because based on my reading of the introduction of the publicly available introduction part of the book, I found it very, very fascinating. And so now I'll just open up the forum for a discussion and questions.
Sure.
Yeah. If anybody has any questions, you can directly unmute your microphone and raise, or you can even post in the chat box. Then we'll take it up. Um, any questions? You can show a raise of hands or.
Why don't you coordinate it? I can't see. So if you could explain the rationale behind the title. So,
Okay.
well, the title was decided by committee by the publishers. The original dissertation title was Victorious Rebels and the Defeated Revolution, in the sense that my book is the first non-Marxist book on peasant rebellions in 40 years. The last one was by Samuel Popkin called The Rational Peasant. And I urge all of you to read that book. It's a fantastic book on the Vietnam War. And he presents a conservative explanation for the Vietnam War, in which he says the Vietnamese peasants wanted to get a better life. They actually wanted reforms that helped them. And they weren't Marxists. They wanted economic control. And so, this is quite an interesting thing. So firstly, it was decided by committee. Second, it looks at how elites capture rebellions. That essentially the rebellions happen in two steps. The elites cater to the peasants and provide the peasants resources to rebel. And that's based on the resource mobilization theory of social movements, McCarthy and Zalt, and so on and so forth. So that's part one. Part two is based on Mansur Olson, who's a public choice theorist, who says small groups with money and economic and political power are much better positioned than large groups to control policy outcomes. Why? Because they have money and power to divide the larger group, co-opt parts of them, repress others, and also to coordinate among themselves. Because collective action is much easier in smaller groups rather than larger groups. So ironically, it is the peasants' large size and their poverty, the power, the large size, poverty, the reason why they rebel, which ultimately leads to their defeat. In terms of their poverty, they need to ally with the elites. In terms of the large size, they win the rebellions, but when these elite allies turn against them, they are prone to being co-opted or repressed, or marginalized in other ways. So undoing the revolution is the critical takeaway of the book, is how elites undermine successful rebellions, peasant rebellions, by the way. It's very important to remember this. This is not about industrialized countries. This is about agrarian economies, because these factors don't apply as such in more developed economies. And we see some of this playing out in India today, where you have much more autonomous risings, that because people are in cities, tier 2, tier 3 cities, and they can coordinate among themselves, and they're educated. They have a lot of these facilities that in the 1920s and 30s peasants just didn't.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, so Anuj Goyal is a PhD student here in Public Policy Department. So the question is, what do you think about the role of elites in current peasant movement in India?
I think they're absolutely critical. I mean, if you look at the caste breakdown, sorry.
Yeah, Nivedita, we'll take your question a little later. So he's currently
Okay,
answering
sure,
Anuj's question. Yeah? Thanks.
So yes, the caste breakdown, or the sort of the caste ethnic breakdown. I mean, this present movement has a lot of Jat Sikh involvement. I would like to see where the Dalits in Punjab and the Mazhabi Sikhs in Punjab lie. Where are they on this movement? And I suspect they're not with this movement. I think that the movement is catered to by a certain set of Sikhs who are not always wealthy, by the way. This needs to be taken into consideration, but who are definitely not, I would classify them as not poor. And this goes back to the system, the land tenure system in Punjab. Punjab had a Mahalwari system. It didn't have a permanent settlement act, zamindari system. So in the Mahalwari system, the land tenure system, the land rent used to be paid collectively to the British government. And also on top of this, Punjab had military grants. And there are exemptions to the Land Ceiling Act of 1950 for military grants, by the way. A lot of people think that the land reform was a state list issue, but it wasn't entirely. There were restrictions. One of them was the military grants, for obvious reasons. I mean, you can't have military grants given away. The cohesion of the Indian army is at stake. And so a lot of the land reform did not take place in Punjab, which also led to its success during the Green Revolution, ironically. So Punjab has a different economic system related to agriculture than most of India. And the elites in Punjab are tied to this agricultural system. I mean, not the current leadership, the head of the leadership, current leadership comes from royalty, we know that. But by and large, they have controlled politics. They sort of, without putting too fine a word on it, a certain set of Punjabis have controlled the politics. Some of the same trends have been there in Haryana as well. But Haryana is more fractured today than it used to be. Their power has waned. But Punjab, they still control the politics. And they are afraid, they are threatened with this change because the Congress system was based on the way to control rural votes was based on controlling these economic nodes, one could say, at these selling centers, the mandis, right? And by the collapse of these mandis, because farmers are now allowed to go elsewhere, you are literally hacking at the rural elites. And I can definitely see how they would be able to corral some popular support, because in the short run, it will cause some dislocations. Any major policy change and economic changes cause dislocations in the short run. They call transaction costs. That's Douglas North's contribution. He won a Nobel Prize for it. And so there are people who are afraid of these transaction costs. They would have some popular support, but definitely local elites are involved. I can see them. I see some photos about foot massage and pizzas being served. I don't think we should take those photos very seriously because tier 2, tier 3 cities today have pizza. It's not the 1980s and 1990s. Everybody knows what a pizza is, especially in northern India, which is highly connected. But we should do a class analysis and also a caste analysis of who these people are. Thank you, Rishabh. I'll take the other question first because I think she was interested.
Nivedita, please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor, for a very interesting presentation. My understanding of this particular subject is limited, but whatever little I know when it comes to land reforms, states like West Bengal, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh have done reasonably well. So it was around the 70s that happened, if I'm not wrong. But what is the state now? We haven't heard of land reforms since then. So what's happening?
Because land reforms are ultimately useless.
Okay.
Because the smaller you break up your land, the worse your productivity of the land is. And it's very good for subsistence agriculture, where it's a safety net. You can survive. But the smaller the plot of land, the less production you have. And so what happens with land reform is it's the prize that never yields the benefit. So that's what happens in Bengal. Land reform happens in the 1970s, which is very interesting that you bring it up. Not in Kerala. Kerala land reform occurs much earlier. In Bengal, it happens in the 1970s because the Bengali, this is a part of the book that I focus on, is about these regional dynamics, these local dynamics. In most of northern India, except Punjab, which was connected to the British Indian Army, in most of northern India, the Hindus were the peasantry, by and large, and the professional class that allied with the peasantry. The old elites, pre-British elites, along with some Hindus, obviously, it's not the 100%, were Muslims. What in UP they used to call it the salariat, salaried Muslims, as well as the Muslim talukdars, the Nawabs. They controlled, in some ways, the heartland politics of India, and they claim to have controlled it for hundreds of years. In Bengal, the situation was exactly the opposite. The Bengali zamindars were mostly Hindus, but the mass of the Bengalis were Muslims, Muslim peasantry. And so here, the peasant rebellion occurred as a Muslim-dominated rebellion. It was secular until the 1930s, but essentially by default of who the peasants were, it had to be in some ways it had to recognize the peasantry as a Muslim body. So you have Muslim peasant leaders, Fazlul Haq is the greatest of them. And the Hindu elites fought on the back foot, similar to the Muhajirs in Pakistan, on the back foot against land reform. And land reform is scotched in various ways in West Bengal. Now, the reason that I'm saying all of this to you is in the 1970s, land reforms do occur in West Bengal. And they are successful, right? Operation Barga is the famous thing. They are successful. And then what happens? Why isn't Bengal like Punjab? That's right? I mean, why isn't Bengal like Punjab? Theoretically, that's what it should be if the land reforms were successful. And they aren't, because after peasants get subsistence plots and they are good, I mean, they subsist, the first thing that happens is you understand that underemployment rises. And a lot of peasants want to move away to the cities. So yes, the pressure is lowered on the cities. The internal migration is lowered initially because subsistence is provided. But then it's not enough. And people want to move out. And the productivity rates are not that great. And therefore the profit rates for continuing to be a peasant are not that great. So it's a short-term solution. It's the same problem in Latin America, by the way. And an economist that I met many years ago, Hernando de Soto, he talked about this. He said, the idea of land reforms is sort of, yes, it helps you initially. It gives you dignity, it gives you political say. In that, it's okay. And I think he would agree with me. But in the long run, for economic productivity, it's just not where it's at.
Thank you, Professor. So there's a question. There's a question by Kumar, but I think before that we can take up Rishabh's question.
Sure.
Please contrast this with village elites of Hindi heartland.
Well, firstly, Rishabh, let me say the comparison is quite difficult because Punjab had a different land tenure system. So let me first caveat that and separate that. So give you that caveat. Secondly, the Hindi heartland used to have similar elites. There's a movie called Mandi. Has anybody watched it? You should watch it. It's from the 1970s, early 80s, right? And it insinuates the set of people that controlled politics. Well, what happens is, and they still exist, by the way, but the entry and exit into this set of elites has become much more open. And as with elites, the power of an elite decreases as entry and exit into the elite decreases. So yes, it's still there is still this elite, but with the breakdown of the caste hierarchy in northern India, which has happened, we cannot deny it. We cannot say that caste. I always constantly hear this. Yes, caste is a problem, and caste violence and caste oppression is still taking place and must be fought against. But we cannot stand here in 2020 and say that we are in 1950. We are not. We're objectively much better in 1950. I'm an American citizen, but I say we in this case because I'm a Hindu, and I believe that caste is a problem within Hinduism. And but we have improved as Hindus about issues of caste in the last 70 years. We know that. And in India, politically, in northern India, it has improved. And as that has improved, there's been mobility. Money has come in, more actors have come in, more players have come in. This set of people have fragmented to different parties, BSP, SP back in the old days. Now with the BJP consolidation, some have moved to BJP, some may move out of BJP. So yes, caste is there, but caste is also the fluidity, the caste mobility has also undermined this set of people in northern India. Their power is a lot less in northern India than, let's say, 50 years ago, or even 40 years ago.
So I think now that we're talking, there are two questions. One is a follow-up question by Anuj, and there's another question by Kumar. So I think one question by Anuj is that, is it not the failure of Punjabi elites to move to non-farm economy in early 1990s, while other elites like Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra elites have done? So is it not, so it is not reflection, is it not reflection or failure of structural transformation? And Kumar is asking, I think these are sort of connected, so I'll just read out the second question also, and then you can face it. So Kumar is asking about, how do you evaluate the effect of abolition of APMC Act in 2006? Did it benefit the peasants of Bihar in any way, or has it given birth to a landless class of Mazdoors for other states? Because this abolition in 2006 is relevant to Bihar only. So,
you know, I don't have the data on Bihar. I need to, so let me answer the second thing. I do not have the data. I would like to see the data before I say it. I want to, because saying, you know, for example, I just made this thing about, you know, I made a statement about Kerala and West Bengal agricultural productivity. And immediately in my mind, I'm saying, well, have you seen the data? When was the last time you saw the data? Has there been statistical, you know, tests to see the linkage between the politics and the agricultural output? I have not. So let me caveat that at the back and say, I don't know. I suspect they could be related, but you know, a structural transformation, let me put it this way. If certain things take place in one state, but they don't take place in other states, that has a different ramification than if something takes place in the entirety of India at the same time. Because the market changes. One is in some ways, one is one player in a market making a decision, saying this is what products, you know, this is what the regulations will be to manufacture products in that we are selling or buying or whatever. The other is that the games for the entire market changes. So I would say I want to see the data before making a decision. And I would say that comparing the two may be difficult because you're comparing in one case the actions of a player and the other case the actions of the entire market, if that makes any sense. Okay, and could you repeat the earlier one?
Sure. No, it's about, Anuj, would you like to come in and continue the question?
Yeah, actually, I just have a comment. Like, if we look the rural elite, the all rural elite being Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, or in other parts of the country, they have basically used the farm surplus to move in non-farm economy. But in the case of Punjab, partly due to insurgency, the rural elite could not move into non-farm economy, and they have remained dependent on farm economy, and they have really made the birth of structural transformation. And because of that, now rural elite in Punjab has no option but to make sure that the state keep subsidizing them or giving them money in agriculture, as they cannot survive in non-agricultural economy. And that's why the whole movement has remained in only in Punjab. Because when we look at Haryana, the part of agriculture surplus has already moved to non-farm economy in cities like Yamunanagar and others, which really does not exist now. Punjab is just an agricultural economy. It's a dying economy if we look at the numbers of overall Punjab economy.
Well, the Punjabis should all come to the American Midwest or the American South, because that's some of the problems in the American agricultural sector are exactly similar. There was no transformation. So you have a situation where American cotton is produced in America and then sent to Central America to be transformed into t-shirts and jeans and then sold back into America because of American government subsidies and regulations about how much cotton there must be in an item from the United States. And these complicated things, for example, American tariffs against foreign imports in food products, a lot of these are done by the agricultural lobby because the agricultural lobby is unsustainable. The agricultural sector is unsustainable because of labor costs primarily. And that also leads to illegal immigration. And in Punjab also it leads to immigration from within India, right? From Bihar, from UP to Punjab, because Punjabis are unwilling to work at those rates there in the agricultural sector. So these problems are solved within India, but yes, I mean, that very well could be that they haven't been able to transform themselves. And that's necessary, right? One of the problems that I've come across with a lot of scholarship is this idea that you can have a successful first world agrarian economy, but you can't. There isn't an agrarian economy that is first world. It has been tried out by some people. Argentina. The problem in the Argentinian economy in that sense was it was extremely prone to international shocks, because if all you're selling are primary products, then you're totally at the behest of whoever the industrialized countries are. So when they want your products, you sell it to them. When they don't want your products, you don't sell it to them, and the terms of trade are awful. So we know all this. So in Punjab, the market was internal. The Green Revolution, they were selling to India and stuff like that. So it wasn't about exports. But it's not sufficient. It was sufficient. It was wealthy in the 1980s and even in the 1990s. But in today's India, it's not the wealthiest. And it's not sufficient for Punjab to go into the 2030s. I agree with you in so many words. I'm sorry, I'm an academic, so I have to use many words to say very tiny things.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Himadri has another question.
Okay. Can I ask just a follow-up on that?
Yes, Himadri.
Yeah, please go ahead, Priyanshu.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so just carrying forward your strand. So are we saying that there's no agrarian elite at all, right? And in fact, there is actually no possibility of an agrarian elite. So then why do we make such a big deal about elites in agriculture areas or elites in rural areas? Is it just a historic phenomena, right? So elite subversion of peasant movements in historicity, we can probably appreciate it, but in current context or even for future, right? So the question of elite itself, it could have been a Marxist category that we sometimes tried to bring into the sector, but I think it's long lost its relevance.
Well, I would say that elites are still there, but the elites are much more fluid. People are coming in, people are going out. They're not been there for generations. An elite grip on society is much lower. In the 1940s or 50s, if you were a Thakur in UP and Bihar, in the villages versus if you are a Thakur today in the villages is an entirely different thing. And that's just about caste positioning. It's also about land ownership. And that's taken decades of work in India. And I don't want to say they don't exist as if they disappeared. They used to exist, and they existed until quite recently, and they still exist. It's just that there are more people who are in the elites. There are more people coming in and going out. In the sense, if you are a rural elite, right? Think of yourself, you own 100 acres or 200 acres in India. It's quite a bit of land, Bihar. And you make money, and you send your children off to college. And so one of them becomes a doctor, and the other of them becomes an engineer, you know, this typical sort of Indian trajectory of things. And but they're not farmers anymore, they're out. They live in Patna, or they move to a smaller tier 3 city like Chhapra in Bihar. I have family in Bihar, so I know Bihar a little better. So they're out. In the old days, they would come back and they would also be village notables, but that entire economy has changed. So yes, there are still elites, but the elites are not entrenched, and the elite power is much lower. But there are still elites, and people still aspire. And also, given the amount of money in the urban areas, and stark contrast with the rural areas in India today, I don't think it's desirable for people to be elites anymore in that sense. But there are still elites. But they are more fluid, and they have different political loyalties, because there are effective number of parties in Bihar and UP are greater than in the 1950s and 60s. There are parties that elites can aspire to join, which are not the one party that's present. You know, in the old days, it was the Congress. So they can aspire to 2 or 3 different political parties. And so again, the elites are divided. Sometimes the elites can unite, and sometimes the elites are entrenched. So if you have entrenched elites who can manage to unite, and by the way, uniting them was a big deal. Gandhi spent years trying to unite them. Congress provincial committees, the entire Congress grassroots organization that was decimated by Indira Gandhi in the 1970s was dedicated to getting local and provincial agricultural elites together and channeling their demands into power. Pradesh Congress, right? But it was decimated by the Congress in the late 1960s. That's the 1969 split. And then, of course, after in 1978, 79, another split. But that used to exist. So those elites still exist. And if some political power comes over who can unite them, and those elites then get more economic power, you know, they become more entrenched, you know, their children also find it, you know, sort of profitable enough to continue, something can recur on those lines. Will it happen? If a structural transformation takes place, which I believe is taking place in India, it won't, because the incentives for doing so would be so low, because people are not going to come into the agricultural areas. The agricultural elites will have different parties to cater to them. The agricultural elites will not be sort of a closed group. There'll be more and more people coming in and going out. So that's my take. I don't know. I want to see the data on that, long-term data, cross-sectional sort of, you know, data on that to see whether the elites exist or not. And another thing I want to add, I took about 3 or 4 pages to define what elites are. Elites disappear once you start approaching your subject. Who is an elite? What is an elite? And every area has its own definition of elites. An elite in West Bengal is not the same as an elite in Kerala, is not the same as an elite in Punjab. And so my take on the elites had to take into account insights from anthropology, from sociology, who have a history, which have sort of demarcated in this area, these set of people were considered the elites. And that would not be considered Marxist. That in fact would be considered quite antithetical to most forms of Marxism to say, you know, I'm letting anthropology and history decide who the elites are instead of simply relying on economic strength and power. Thank you. Sorry to bore you about that as well.
Thank you, Professor. So Himadri has a question. So in your book, you talk about collective and selective incentives of elites and the role of religion. Doesn't that create some sort of rebellion within rebellion and disturb the continuity of the rebellion, especially if there is heterogeneity?
There is always heterogeneity. Thank you. No, that's part of my story. That's core part of my story. Thank you for catching that on. That there are various rebellions, and these rebellions are sort of brokered by national level elites in order to achieve their goals. So, and I inserted that religious rebellion on purpose. Zimbabwe had the religious rebellion, the collective incentives, the we-ness, as I call it. You know, religion is a form in which peasants and elites no longer feel separate from the peasants. So selective incentives for elites go down. They're no longer looking for economic power and economic benefits and political power. They're thinking we are together in this, you know. And that overcomes this barrier to alliance. And this can happen. And I looked at Zimbabwe and then I said to myself, is this a Zimbabwean thing? No, similar things happened in India. I wrote an article, it's a spin-off about India and Mexico where similar things happened. Now, these selective incentives work at the stage of the rebellion. They don't work when you have to choose institutions. So yes, there are many rebellions that different elites, different regional elites ally with in their own regions and, you know, put them across the threshold of success. Or don't ally with. In India, the Malabar rebellion failed because they didn't find people to ally with them. But if you can ally, you succeed. But once you start forming institutions, you have to make concrete choices about policies. You can't say we're all Indians and let's have an institution. Pakistan tried that. It failed. Because by saying, you know, we're all Muslims, let's figure some institutions out, didn't help. I mean, you have to cut the bread. And when you have to cut the bread, some people will get a thick loaf, some people will get a thin loaf, some people will get the heels. And at that point of time, selective incentives start coming back in. What am I getting? How do we coordinate? And so, yes, I mean, that's a critical question. And collective incentives do play a part in rebellion. And that's very sort of controversial in some ways, I think, because, you know, that's more of a Weberian take about the power of religion rather than Marx. Thank you. I hope that answers your question.
Madhuri, I guess. Yeah, his time. Any more questions? All right. So Professor, I have one comment and maybe two questions, but out of which one is partly answered in response to Priyanshu's. So the comment was in terms of the land reforms, the use of land reforms, where I have been thinking, or I'm of the opinion that so land reforms standalone may not be successful in creating the economic productivity and making it more efficient economically. Rather, if you see some of the experiences of the East Asian countries where land reforms sort of happen along with the market, expanding markets. And then we do see definitely there is a interlink between how the rural non-farm and the small plots of land together making a difference in terms of the productivity and which is aiding the structural transformation process, right? So I sort of been of the opinion that in India, what didn't happen probably is the other part of it. Post land reforms, what needs to be done, or the market that was not available. But still, I feel in West Bengal or in Kerala, for that matter, if we see post land reforms, there is strong rural non-farm economy, at least in terms of the data when we look at it. There are more highly productive, relatively highly productive informal enterprises in the rural areas in these two states. Some part we even see a little bit in Punjab, where you have the rural non-farm economy to some extent doing better in comparison to the other states. So that's one thought I had. But other than that, so what my what part that interested me the most in the book also is the idea of elite. And from the introduction, I get that elite you have divided into two types, where one is a landed elite based on their ownership or the control over land, and the other elite is based on their control over this mobile assets, like physical capital or human skills, right? So isn't it, in a way, it's again, isn't it boiling down to the economic elite based on the control of the ownership of means of production? So in that sense, I was finding it a little difficult to understand how is this very much different from a Marxist class category, Marxist economic classes of capitalists, landlords, and peasants. So in this sort of analysis, so that was my question. Thank you.
That's a fantastic question. Firstly, I don't know. That's why I went to understand. I don't know the data about West Bengal and Kerala, so I must go back. Because I strongly believe, unlike more senior colleagues, that if the data disproves me, it disproves me. That's what that's how it is. So yeah, I mean, so to address that question, if the data disproves me, so it does, so it stands. Maybe the problem is about scaling up rather than sort of the actual, whether that impetus is there, but rather to scale up, to provide credit. And I'd just like to address a little bit. There's, when I read the new farm bills, Section 9 talks about the government guaranteeing access to credit for farmers. And I find that very problematic, because what should have happened is the abrogation of the Land Ceiling Act. So alienation of land, acquisition and alienation of land should have been made free. It would lead to concentration of land. It always does. And the government could have either broadened the Land Ceiling Act to 200, 500 acres or so on and so forth, so to keep it within manageable sizes. But the government should not play this situation where land is not alienable. You can't buy and sell land. Because what happens is then the government has to repeatedly come in to bail out to the farmers. I can definitely see this happening. Farmers will take advances. Farmers will be unable to pay back these advances. The government will have to bail out the farmers. And once that happens and that becomes a trend, then you introduce moral hazard, in the sense, why would a farmer try to pay back the advance if the government covers the farmer? So there are problems with that. One of the ways to improve on that is probably to make usufruct rights alienable and transferable, rather, not alienable, but transferable, rather than actual ownership. And that could be that, so there are ways to address that. So yes, these are issues about doing things incompletely, and that gets back to your point, and that does support your point. About the Marxist take, what I tried to do is the sort of bridge class with collective action. And I think this goes back to Himadri's question as well. I looked at class identity of the elites, and it's not really class, because Marx would say you have feudal elites and you have non-feudal elites. It's capital, land. These are sort of Marxist things. But if you notice my breakdown, it's not just about capital and land, it's also about domestic capital, foreign capital, domestic landowners, foreign landowners, and their incentives are separate. And this is something that Marx doesn't talk about. Because for Marx, capital is capital, so on and so forth. The other thing Marx does not talk about is the independent effect of religion, for example. And that could be transferred to anything else. By the way, the religion is a stand-in. I had more religious cases. It could be ethnicity, it could be tribal loyalty. These things could be transferred. So again, that's a separate thing. The third thing is about how and why, how collective action takes place. So in this, we see two things. One part of it supports Marx, which is the fact that peasants have a collective action problem. They need to class coalition, basically, is what the old literature used to call it. They need to ally with elites who then overcome the collective action barriers. Class coalition does not put it in that way, but they approach it. My work dovetails, my work agrees with them. The other part of it, however, my work does not agree, is the way I see that the outcomes are much more fluid. They're not predetermined. right? There's a lot of bargaining going on. There's a lot of uncertainty within the outcomes. And these uncertainties depend not just about who owns what assets, but whether they are citizens of that country or not. Because citizenship does change your perspective on things. You're willing to sacrifice more for your country rather than, for a foreign land. And that's a key element to one of the findings. And Marx would say, if you lost it, that's not really what I wanted at all. So yes, it agrees with Marxism, but it disagrees with Marxism on other things. The end of it is, it agrees with a strand of what you can call Orthodox Marxism. An Orthodox Marxist would believe that peasants are incapable of revolution. There's no peasant revolution as possible. And partly because I don't think Marx understood collective action that well, but partly because in the terms of sort of understanding at the individual level, because there's no access to these resources. Marx doesn't talk about that too much, but he calls peasants a sack of potatoes, and I quote him for calling peasants a sack of potatoes. It's terrible, right? But then the Maoists in India, who are there in India, don't believe in that, because theirs is a variation of Marxism that believes in sort of peasant rebellion. And my conclusion of the book actually talks about Maoists in India at present. And I say that the Maoist rebellions will not succeed because of X, Y, and Z issues. So yes, so it partly agrees with Marx, but it partly moves away from Marx and sort of undermines Marx. How do you interpret the? Himadri, that's a good question.
In fact, that's another question that I was leading to, because I see that the way you have portrayed that the elite alliance of peasants is inevitable, but also in this process, peasants are remarginalized, and which is also inevitable. So what is the way out? And, so yeah.
I think one of you very smart people, very intelligent people, you guys are at IIM, so you guys are the best in the country, have already answered the question. Have already answered the structural transformation. You have to industrialize. You have to industrialize. And let me tell you something. One of the worst lies, myths of the 20th century has been the idea that modernization is peaceful. Modernization is violent. Modernization is destabilizing. Old actors do not give up power. Sometimes people who unleash modernization realize what they have done and try to put a brake on modernization. I think that's what happened in India in the 1970s. That the Nehruvian modernization, which was started, I don't like to call it Nehruvian because I don't think Nehru was really, I disagree. I don't think he had an idea of what actually was going on. They started that industrialization, and then they realized new actors are coming in. New people like George Fernandez are coming in. People like Chandrasekhar are coming in. A lot of about these characters from the 80s and 90s, right? And these people are not going to listen to the old elites, the old sort of established elites. And they're like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And that's part of the problem of, and Indira Gandhi counter mobilizes in 1971 with a populist pitch, but can't control the expectations. And that leads to the emergency. So modernization is violent because there are uncertainties attached to it. Old elites are crumbling, new elites are coming in. People are angry, people want more things, right? One of the thing I learned in India, I was in 2004, first time I went to actually do work back in India, 6 years after I had left, was I was explaining to somebody about, what they wanted, and they were talking to me. We were having a drink and a smoke, probably at one of these Delhi bars, Silver Grill or something, I forget, or Silver Dragon or something. And he said to me, the real problem is, back in the day, the poor people, they didn't know what the rich people had, but now they all have TVs. And so modernization So actually, the poor people are better off. So, modernization changes all of that. But modernization is violent. It is a process. Now, violence in two ways. One is actual violence, physical violence. The other is structural violence, impoverishment, because certain sectors of the economy will die. And there is no nice way to put it, right? Barrington Moore says that you have a choice. Either you go, rapid modernization has two choices, extreme choices. One is you perish slowly in the mills of Lancashire in England, or you have a machine gun behind your head in a gulag in the Soviet Union. There, he's citing extreme examples, but he calls out, if you should read it, it's from 1966, I think, 66, Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. He pillories Nehru. He says, what have you done? He says, this is a class compromise. So you have this democracy, but there has been no modernization. The cost of this democracy is modernization. And he talks about this in 1966. He pillories Nehru. He says, you've done half. This is a half sort of development. You got to move if you want to modernize India. You have to be able to impose these things, and it is violent. And so we are seeing in India a lot of this right now. But I think that there's also a push, and this is probably my take. When I was in Delhi last time, and I went to this very fancy tailor, not for me, somebody else, a fancy tailor in Connaught Place in Delhi, which is, very shishi. And he'd been there for generations. And he said, in the old days, the right sort of people came into my shop and they bought the right kind of things. And these days, everybody comes in and it's just so crowded. I wish, I don't like to say this, but I wish the old days were back. This is a man who's made a lot of money under liberalization. A Delhi trader of his status would probably own a car and a scooter back in the 1980s. He probably drives Mercedes-Benzes and stuff today. But he doesn't want it because his social status is affected, right? And this is the pressure of modernization, because old elites don't want to give up power. You see, it's difficult. It's difficult to accept it. But modernization, there's a lot of people who will say, enough. We cannot introduce markets. We have to go in for protection of the economy, and we have to stop things. The structural transformation is the devil. I mean, you have to accept it, and it's very destabilizing. Sorry again. I hope I'm not rambling.
No. That's a very very useful account. So if there are any more questions or comments, we can just take for like 2 minutes. Otherwise, we can wrap up the session. Any comments or any questions? So I'll take it as a no, because there is no more questions. So thank you very much, Professor. I think it's been very interesting. And first of all, for me to particularly to hear a non-Marxist account on peasant rebellions. So with some agreements, some disagreements, and I can say with a lot of curiosity to see what's in detail in your book. And I think, so we can...
I think what I'll do is I'll send, since the two organizers are both of you, I'll take your addresses and then I'll just send 2 copies of the books to the 2 of you.
Oh, that would be amazing. Thank you. Yeah. So thank you very much for giving your time. I know it's like 1.5 hours. It's a long time, but I'm sure it's been useful. And this session will be recorded and available on YouTube or Radio Sofia channel, which other audience can also listen to. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.